It began, as such things often do, not with an event, but with a whisper. A quiet suspicion. A trembling awareness that the world, in all its shimmering familiarity, was suddenly more fragile than I had imagined. One night, I found myself standing before a window, just standing. The city below flickered and buzzed with life, with neon and wheels, with people hurtling forward into plans. And yet, I was outside of it all. There was no tragedy in the room, no phone call from a hospital, no funeral procession winding through memory. But there was death. Or rather, the thought of it. The sudden gravity of its inevitability. It wasn't fear, not entirely. Nor was it grief. It was a kind of awe. A dreadful reverence. The way one might feel staring too long into the ocean, knowing it does not care whether you float or sink. In that moment, I realized I had not yet thought about death. Not truly. I had glanced at it from the corners of books, nodded to it in the fine print of insurance, heard it in the closing tones of documentaries. But I had not stopped. I had not let it enter the room. That night, it did. And it sat beside me. We spend our days building. Building identities, building routines, building beliefs. We carry ourselves as though the world is a stable thing, and we are central to it. But every now and then, the scaffolding creaks. You wake in the middle of the night and forget your name. You see an old photograph and realize everyone in it is gone. You read a line from a novel that breaks something open. That is how death arrived, not as a figure in black, but as a question. What if everything I know is only a prelude? What if the real story begins at the end? I started reading differently. Walking differently. Listening, as if every voice might be the last time I heard it. I noticed old people more, not just their stooped spines or slow gait, but their eyes. The ones who had buried friends, spouses, children. I wondered what they saw when they closed their eyes. Did they regret more than they remembered? Or had they made peace with the ending? I remembered how we talk about death, sanitized, distant, almost sterile. We don't die anymore, we pass away. We don't mourn, we celebrate a life. But that night, I didn't want celebration. I wanted honesty. I wanted to stare the thing in the face. And it terrified me. Not because I thought death was painful, but because it was unknown. Because I could not prepare for it. Because no matter how many books I read or rituals I practiced, I would go alone. Into what? Oblivion? Judgment? Nothingness? This question began to haunt my hours. And yet, it also sharpened them. If death was certain, then life was not guaranteed. If every breath was unpromised, then each was a kind of miracle. I found myself pausing more. Touching things. Thanking my hands for still working, my legs for still moving. I looked longer at the sky. I said I love you without waiting for the perfect moment. I understood, finally, that there is no perfect moment. Only this one. And then I remembered Leo Tolstoy. A man who had everything, wealth, nobility, genius, and who still trembled before death like a frightened child. A man who, in the final years of his life, was so overwhelmed by the specter of mortality that he renounced it all, the estates, the novels, even his family. He wandered into the cold, seeking some kind of truth. Some kind of answer. Tolstoy's story gripped me because it was not distant. It was not about someone who had lived and died in the abstract. It was about someone who had felt exactly what I was feeling, the slow unraveling of meaning in the face of the ultimate end. His confession, written in his 50s, is not a religious tract, it is a cry. A howl. A questioning of everything he once believed. He had written War and Peace, and yet peace eluded him. He had understood characters down to their bones, and yet could not explain his own heart. He had loved, fathered, lectured, and led, but when death entered the room, none of it held. It is in Tolstoy that I found a companion. Not a guide, he never claimed to know the way, but a fellow traveler. Someone who also stared into the abyss and refused to look away. Someone who asked the hardest question, what is the point of a life that ends? There is a moment in the Death of Ivan Ilyich, one of Tolstoy's most devastating works, when the main character, a successful judge, realizes he is dying. Slowly, terribly, unglamorously. What follows is not a hero's journey, but a descent into truth. As Ivan's body fails him, he begins to see the lie he has lived. The false pursuits. The status. The masks. The death is not sudden, it is torturously slow. And that, Tolstoy insists, is the real horror, the time to reflect. To realize how much of life was wasted pretending. And yet, it is also a mercy. Because it allows Ivan to see, before the end, what really matters. This struck me deeply. Because I, too, had been running. Not from death, perhaps, but from its implications. I had filled my days with noise, tasks, ambitions. I had assumed time was elastic. That I could always start the real life later. When I had more money, or more clarity, or more energy. But what if this is it? Not the rehearsal, but the play? Thinking about death did not make me depressed. Quite the opposite, it made me aware. Alive. In a strange and almost embarrassing way, it made me grateful. I saw that the sunset was not a background, but an event. That my friend's laughter was not a sound, but a privilege. That waking up tomorrow is not a right, but a gift. And it made me want to live differently. Not because I feared death, but because I respected it. Because I knew that, like Ivan Ilyich, I would one day lie in bed and count the ways I betrayed myself. Unless I began now, this hour, to live a little truer. And so I turned again to Tolstoy, not for answers, but for courage. For the raw, unsanitized wrestling with the big questions. For a mirror that didn't flatter. Tolstoy did not offer easy resolutions. He stripped life bare and asked, again and again, if you were to die tonight, would you be ready? That question is not meant to shame. It is meant to awaken. If you've made it this far, it means you're not just listening, you're contemplating. And if these words have stirred something in you, consider liking the video, sharing it with someone who needs to hear this, and subscribing. Not for the numbers, but to keep building a space where honesty matters. Tolstoy was not a young man when the fear of death finally broke through his carefully cultivated world. He was not a nihilistic teenager or a morbid philosopher gazing into the void for the aesthetic of it. He was a man who had lived, truly lived. He had tasted every delight life offered and accomplished more than most dream of. By the time he was 50, he had written two of the greatest novels in human history. War and Peace and Anna Karenina were already secured in the pantheon of literary immortality. And yet, in a confession, he admits, none of it could save him. He wrote, "My question, that which at the age of 50 brought me to the verge of suicide, was the simplest of questions, lying in the soul of every man. What will come of what I am doing today or shall do tomorrow? What will come of my whole life? Why should I live? Why wish for anything, or do anything?" The question was not dramatic. It was disarmingly simple. And it is the same question we all must face if we dare to stop and listen. What is the point of this if I am going to die? What frightened Tolstoy was not just the fact of death. It was what death revealed about his life. He saw that he had built castles out of sand. That his pursuits, glory, reputation, pleasure, were houses with no foundation. When death rose like a tide, they vanished, leaving him naked. He began to look around, searching for answers. He consulted science, philosophy, art. He read widely and deeply. But every answer only led to more emptiness. Science could describe the world, but not its meaning. Philosophy offered clever frameworks, but no comfort. Art, even his own, suddenly seemed ornamental, a distraction, not a guide. And so he turned to the one place he had long ignored, religion. But not in the traditional sense. Tolstoy did not return to the church of his childhood. He sought something deeper, rawer. A spirituality not of ritual but of truth. What he found startled him. He looked at the peasants, the poor, uneducated laborers who worked his lands. He noticed that they, unlike him, did not fear death. They accepted it. Not with resignation, but with peace. Their lives were difficult. Often brutal. Yet they held a kind of quiet wisdom he, with all his education, lacked. They believed in something. In God, yes, but more than that, in purpose. In right and wrong. In humility. In the idea that life was not about accumulation, but service. That the measure of a life was not success, but sincerity. Tolstoy was undone. He had spent decades climbing a ladder only to realize it was leaning against the wrong wall. This realization led to what we now call his spiritual crisis, but it was not a crisis in the dramatic sense. It was more like a slow burning away. Over years, Tolstoy began to shed his former life, its titles, its wealth, its privileges. He stopped writing novels for nearly 2 decades. He began instead to write parables, religious essays, philosophical treatises. He championed nonviolence, simplicity, manual labor. He tried to live like the peasants he had once ruled over. The world looked on in confusion. Some called him a saint. Others, a madman. But Tolstoy did not care. He had seen what the world could not, that death makes fools of all our pretensions. He no longer feared death. He feared living falsely. And yet, Tolstoy was not at peace. Not fully. He still quarreled, often bitterly, with his wife, with the church, with his followers. His spiritual convictions became more intense, sometimes severe. He demanded moral purity in a world made of compromises. He longed for a kind of purity that seemed just out of reach. In many ways, he became more isolated. But in other ways, he became more universal. His later writings influenced Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and countless others. He became not just a writer, but a prophet, one who dared to speak truths most would rather avoid. And always, death hovered nearby. But now it was not an intruder. It was a teacher. Near the end of his life, in 1910, Tolstoy did something astonishing. At the age of 82, in the dead of night, he fled his home. Disguised and feverish, he boarded a train alone. His goal? To leave everything behind. To die in anonymity. He made it only a short way before collapsing at a remote railway station called Astapovo. There, in a station master's house, Tolstoy lay dying, surrounded not by nobility, but by strangers, journalists, the press. His family came, but the divisions remained. And yet, in those final hours, one senses something remarkable. He whispered of love. Of light. He spoke softly. As though the storm had passed. He died not in grandeur, but in simplicity. As he had once longed to. Tolstoy's journey is not comforting in the conventional sense. He does not offer answers that let us sleep easy. But he does something more valuable. He asks the right questions. He shows us what it looks like when a man of immense intellect, success, and privilege realizes none of it can stop death. And instead of running from that truth, he walks into it. Slowly. Bravely. uneasily. He teaches us that the fear of death is not a curse, it is a gift. It is a summons. A call to wake up. To look around and ask, what am I building? Why am I rushing? Whose voice am I obeying? To understand that time is not a resource, it is the arena. The test. The gift. And to realize, perhaps too late, that the things we think matter, our jobs, our followers, our resumes, will not matter when we are lying in bed, unable to move, waiting for the last breath. When I read Tolstoy now, I don't see an old man grasping for meaning. I see a man stripping away everything that isn't real. A man begging us, across the centuries, to stop pretending. To live as if death is not the end of meaning, but the beginning of honesty. He wrote not to comfort us, but to confront us. And in doing so, he gave us a kind of map. Not a map to avoid death, but one to live, before it's too late. Tolstoy once wrote, "Only people who are capable of loving strongly can also suffer great sorrow, but this same necessity of loving serves to counteract their grief and heals them." I used to read that quote and nod, as one nods at wisdom one hasn't yet earned. But it wasn't until I lost my mother that I truly understood what it meant. She died gently, the way some people enter rooms, quietly, without drama, but entirely changing the atmosphere. There was no wailing, no catastrophic collapse of the world. Just absence. Terrible, echoing absence. I remember the silence most of all. The way the house sounded without her voice in it. The way the sun kept rising as though nothing had happened. The way grief didn't scream, but waited. Sat with me. Like an old, unwelcome guest. In those early days, people said the usual things. She's in a better place. She's watching over you. She'd want you to be strong. I nodded. I said thank you. But inside, I was asking the same question Tolstoy once asked, why? What is the point of all this if even love must die? And yet, she hadn't died. Not entirely. She lived in the way I folded my clothes, just like she taught me. In the way I scolded myself for slouching. In the rhythm of my speech. In the absurd little phrases she used to say, like, "Life is not about waiting for the storm to pass, it's about learning to dance in the rain." She said it so often it became a joke between us. I would roll my eyes. But now, when the storms come, and they do come, I hear her. And suddenly, I'm not alone. There was something in her that knew death was coming, even years before the diagnosis. She had a calm about her. A stillness. Not indifference, but acceptance. She used to tell me, death isn't the opposite of life. It's part of it. Like the last chapter of a book that's meant to be read slowly. She didn't fear it. And not because she was religious, though she had faith. It was because she had lived. She had loved fiercely, given generously, laughed until she cried. She had suffered, too, but she never let it harden her. Watching her die wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was realizing she would never again give me advice I didn't ask for. That I would never again smell her cooking on a lazy Sunday. That her stories, the ones I used to tune out, were now irretrievable. And yet, I felt closer to her than ever. Not in some supernatural way, but in the way the dead linger in the living. Not haunting us, but holding us. Not appearing in mirrors, but in memories. In instincts. In values. In the way I pause before speaking. In the way I forgive. In the way I love. It's strange, death, the thing I once feared, now seems like the teacher I never asked for but always needed. Tolstoy spent his life running from the fear of death, until he realized the only escape was to die before you die. To let go of everything false, and live from what's real. That's what my mother did, in her own quiet way. She didn't write novels or lead revolutions. She never stood on a podium or made speeches. But she loved in a way that outlived her body. And that, I've come to believe, is the only kind of immortality that matters. Tolstoy stripped his life to the bone in search of meaning. My mother embodied it, often without trying. And me? I'm still somewhere in between. Learning, slowly, to see death not as an enemy, but as a mirror. There's a line from Anna Karenina that returns to me now, soft and steady. All the variety, all the charm, all the beauty of life is made up of light and shadow. We cannot have the one without the other. We cannot truly see life until we have looked directly at death. Until we have buried someone we loved. Until we have stood at the edge and not turned away. To live in the shadow of death is not to be morbid. It is to be awake. It is to realize that every hug might be the last. Every walk, every word, every morning is borrowed. And to treat it all, not with fear, but with reverence. I used to think death was the final enemy. Now, I see it as a sculptor. It chips away what doesn't matter, until all that's left is the truth, love, presence, humility, and the courage to live honestly. Tolstoy tried to teach that with his pen. My mother taught it with her hands. I'm still trying to live it with my choices. This video is not a eulogy. It is not even about death, really. It is about what death reveals. It reveals what we love. It reveals what we fear. And if we let it, it reveals who we really are. And so I leave you with this, not as a conclusion, but as a beginning. Live. Not in defiance of death, but because of it. Say what you mean. Touch what you love. Forgive while there's time. Look up. Look in. Look around. And remember that every soul you meet is walking toward the same end. Be kind. Be awake. And don't wait for the storm to pass. Learn, as my mother would say, to dance in the rain. If this resonated with you, even just a little, leave a like. Share it with someone wrestling with the same questions. And subscribe if you believe that death isn't the end of the conversation, but the start of living with intention. There's more to explore. And I'd be honored to do it with you.